Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight, we travel to a city that no longer exists, or rather, to a city that exists only partially, the visible part standing on a narrow spit of land at the entrance to Kingston Harbor in Jamaica, and the invisible part lying beneath the warm water of the harbor where it sank on a June morning in 1692, in the space of a few terrible minutes. We are going to Port Royal, the city that was once called the most wicked city on earth, the richest city in the English Americas, the pirate capital of the Caribbean, and the place where God, according to the people who survived its destruction, finally ran out of patience with what human beings were doing there. Port Royal is one of the most extraordinary stories in the whole history of the Caribbean, which is itself one of the most extraordinary bodies of water in the history of the world. It is a story about what happens when a place is perfectly situated at the intersection of enormous flows of wealth and power and becomes, for a few decades, the place where all of that intersection comes to its most vivid and most chaotic expression. It is a story about the pirates and the merchants and the governors and the enslaved people and the free people and the priests and the prostitutes and all the other inhabitants of a city that existed in a moral universe quite different from the one that its rulers and its clergymen claimed to be enforcing. And it is a story about the sea, which in the end resolved the question of Port Royal with the particular thoroughness of a force that does not negotiate. It is also a story that belongs to the night, because Port Royal was above all a nighttime city, a place that came alive after dark when the ships were in the harbor and the buccaneers were ashore and the taverns were full and the money was moving and the violence that was always present just below the surface of Caribbean colonial. Life broke through with the regularity of the tides. The night is the right time to tell this story. In the dark, where the sounds you hear are the sounds of water moving against a shore somewhere close by, and the stories of the people who built a city and lost it feel both very old and very near. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the Caribbean come to you, warm and dark and full of history. Let us begin. Jamaica is a long, narrow island, about 230 kilometers from end to end, and at most 80 kilometers wide, sitting in the northern Caribbean, about 150 kilometers south of Cuba, and the same distance west of Hispaniola. It is mountainous in the interior, the Blue Mountains in the eastern part of the island, rising to more than 2,000 meters, forested and misty and cool in a way that seems surprising given the tropical latitude. The coastlines are varied, with long sandy beaches on the north coast and more rugged terrain on the south, and the island is cut through by numerous rivers that flow down from the mountains to the sea, making it well watered by Caribbean standards and capable of supporting a substantial agricultural population. The indigenous people of Jamaica, when the Spanish arrived, were the Taino, the same Arawak-speaking people who inhabited the other large islands of the Caribbean, and their fate was the same as their counterparts elsewhere: rapid population decline following contact with European diseases and the violence of colonial conquest. Within a century of the Spanish arrival, in 1509, the Taino population of Jamaica had been essentially destroyed, leaving the island to be repopulated by the Spanish colonists and the enslaved Africans they brought with them to work the sugar plantations and cattle ranches that were the basis of the Spanish colonial economy on the island. The Spanish colony of Jamaica, with its capital at Santiago de la Vega in the interior of the island, was never one of the most important parts of the Spanish Empire. It produced sugar and hides and some timber, and it served as a useful stopping point for ships crossing between the larger colonies. But it lacked the silver and gold that made the mainland colonies so valuable, and the Spanish invested relatively little in its development compared to the resources they put into Mexico or Peru. The population was small, perhaps 1,500 Spanish colonists and several thousand enslaved Africans, and the military defenses of the island were correspondingly modest. The English arrived in 1655 as part of what was called the Western Design, an aggressive colonial policy promoted by Oliver Cromwell that was intended to break Spanish dominance of the Caribbean by capturing one or more of the larger Spanish islands. The original target was Hispaniola, and the expedition that arrived there was a substantial one, several thousand soldiers under the command of General Robert Venables and Admiral William Penn. The attack on Hispaniola was a disaster, the Spanish defenders proving far more formidable than the English commanders had expected, and the expedition retreated in disorder, its commanders badly needing a success to report back to Cromwell. Jamaica, with its smaller garrison and its more divided defenders, was the consolation prize. The English forces landed in May of 1655. The Spanish governor quickly recognized that the island could not be held, and negotiations for a surrender began almost immediately. The terms of the surrender allowed the Spanish colonists to leave with their possessions, but many of the enslaved Africans who had served the Spanish chose or were given the opportunity to escape into the mountains rather than pass into English ownership, and they became the nucleus of the maroon communities, the communities of escaped slaves who maintained their freedom in the interior of Jamaica throughout the colonial period, and who were never fully conquered by either the Spanish or the English. The English settlers who came to Jamaica in the years after the conquest found an island with good soil and good water and a climate that was productive for tropical agriculture, and they began developing it with the same plantation system that was already established in Barbados and the other English Caribbean colonies. Sugar became the dominant crop, requiring large numbers of enslaved workers, and the slave trade that brought those workers from West Africa became one of the central features of the Jamaican economy. By the end of the 17th century, Jamaica had become one of the most important sugar-producing colonies in the English Empire and one of the largest importers of enslaved Africans in the Atlantic world. But before the sugar economy fully established itself, Jamaica had another economic foundation, one that was more dramatic and more dangerous, and that gave the island its particular character in the second half of the 17th century. That foundation was the buccaneer trade, the network of semi-piratical activity centered on Port Royal that made the English colony in Jamaica simultaneously a menace to the Spanish Empire and a valuable asset to the English crown. The harbor at Kingston, enclosed by the long, narrow spit of land called the Palisadoes, was one of the best natural harbors in the Caribbean, deep enough to accommodate the largest ships and protected from weather and attack by the geography of the spit and the surrounding land. The English colonial authorities recognized its value almost immediately after the conquest, and they establish a settlement at the end of the spit that they called Point Kagwe, and that would be renamed Port Royal after the restoration of Charles II to the English throne in 1660. This settlement, at the very tip of the palisados, where the entrance to the harbor was narrowest, and where any ship entering the harbor would have to pass within cannon range of the shore, was the germ of the city that would become Port Royal. The early years of Port Royal were characterized by the particular mixture of necessity and opportunity that drives the growth of colonial settlements in difficult circumstances. The English colonists in Jamaica were in a precarious position, surrounded by Spanish colonies that resented the loss of the island, and by a sea that carried both opportunities and threats in roughly equal proportions. They needed income, they needed protection, and they needed a military deterrent that would make the Spanish think twice before attempting to retake the island. The buccaneers provided all three simultaneously, and the colonial authorities in Jamaica cultivated the relationship with a pragmatism that sometimes horrified the home government in London. The arrangement was straightforward in outline if complicated in practice. The buccaneers received letters of marque from the Jamaican governor authorizing them to attack Spanish shipping and Spanish coastal settlements. In return, they used Port Royal as their base, bringing their prizes into the harbor and spending their plunder in the town's markets and taverns and shops. The colonial government collected a share of the prize proceeds. The merchants and tavern keepers prospered from the spending of the buccaneers, and the Spanish colonies to the south and west found themselves facing a persistent and capable military threat that tied down resources they would otherwise have used against Jamaica. The buccaneers who used Port Royal came from the same mixed background as the Tortuga community, though the English element was more prominent in Jamaica than it had been in the French-dominated Tortuga. They were former sailors and soldiers, and servants and slaves, men who had found no place for themselves in the ordered world of European colonial society, and who had discovered that the pirate trade offered a combination of income and independence that was not available anywhere else. They were rough and dangerous, and thoroughly uninterested in the moral codes that governed respectable colonial life, and Port Royal was shaped by their presence in ways that distinguished it from every other colonial town in the English Americas. The physical layout of Port Royal reflected the speed and pragmatism of its growth. It was built on sand, quite literally, on the accumulated sediment of the harbor entrance that formed the palisados, and this sandbank location had important consequences both for the character of the city and for its eventual fate. The sand did not provide the stable foundation that stone buildings required, which meant that most of Port Royal's construction was in wood, the quick and cheap building material of choice for a town that expected to grow rapidly and was not particularly concerned about permanence. The streets were narrow and irregular, laid out not according to any plan, but according to the practical requirements of a harbor town that was growing in response to demand rather than design. By the 1660s and 1670s, Port Royal had grown into a town of perhaps 8,000 people, which made it one of the largest urban settlements in the English Americas and one of the most densely populated places in the Caribbean. The density was remarkable. The houses packed closely together on the narrow spit with the harbor on one side and the open sea on the other, and the streets between them barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably. The harbor side was lined with wharves, where the ships loading and unloading their cargoes and the town behind the wharves was a jumble of warehouses and shops and taverns and houses and the occasional church, all compressed into a space that was far smaller than the population it contained. The warehouses of Port Royal held the goods of an international trade that was unusual even by Caribbean standards. There was the legitimate commerce, sugar and rum and hides, and timber moving out of Jamaica, and manufactured goods and food, and slaves moving in. And there was the less legitimate commerce, the prize goods that the buccaneers brought in from their raids on Spanish shipping and Spanish towns, goods that had no documentation and no clear ownership, but that found ready buyers in a town that was not inclined to ask too many questions about the origins of things that were being offered at attractive prices. The merchants of Port Royal understood that their prosperity depended on both streams of commerce and that maintaining a clear distinction between them would have been both practically difficult and commercially disadvantageous. The wealth that flowed through Port Royal in its heyday was genuinely extraordinary. The value of the goods that moved through its harbor, both legitimate and otherwise, made it one of the richest ports in the Americas, and the money that circulated in its economy created a standard of living for its upper classes that rivaled anything available in the English colonies of North America. The great merchants of Port Royal built substantial houses and filled them with the goods of the Atlantic trade, with silver plate and fine furniture and the other markers of prosperity that the 17th century recognized. They drank good wine and ate well, and employed slaves to manage their households, and they regarded themselves, with some justification, as the commercial elite of the English Caribbean. The reputation of Port Royal as the most wicked city in the world was not invented after the fact to explain its destruction. It was actively maintained by the people who lived there, and who clearly took some pride in the place's exceptional character, and it was confirmed by virtually every visitor who wrote about the town in the decades before the earthquake. The exact phrase, "most wicked city on earth," is associated with the aftermath of the earthquake and the sermons that clergymen delivered in its wake. But the substance of the charge, that Port Royal was a place of extraordinary vice and disorder, was a commonplace of Caribbean commentary long before June of 1692. The taverns were the most visible expression of Port Royal's character, and there were a great many of them. Estimates from the period, which may be exaggerated but are probably not entirely fabricated, suggest that there was approximately one tavern for every 10 inhabitants of the town, which by any standard represents a remarkable concentration of drinking establishments in a small space. The taverns were not merely places to drink. Though drinking was certainly central to their function, they were the social hubs of the buccaneer community, the places where crews were recruited and voyages planned and prizes celebrated and disputes settled, sometimes through the formal mechanisms of the articles, and sometimes through the more direct mechanism of a fight. The drinking culture of Port Royal was shaped by the availability of rum, the sugar-based spirit that the Caribbean produced in large quantities and sold cheaply, and by the particular psychology of men who spent long periods at sea in dangerous conditions and who, when they returned to shore, were inclined to consume everything available with the urgency of people who understood that the opportunity might not recur. The accounts of contemporary observers describes scenes of extraordinary excess, men spending their prize money in days or weeks on drink and gambling and the other pleasures that the town offered, and then going back to sea because they had nothing left and no other way to live. The gambling was as serious as the drinking, and the fortunes that changed hands over the gaming tables of Port Royal in the course of an evening were sometimes substantial. The buccaneers who came ashore with significant prize money were known to gamble it away with a speed that astonished observers from more careful cultures, and the merchants and tavern keepers of Port Royal were expert at separating the sailors from their money in ways that left both parties broadly satisfied with the transaction. The gaming houses operated alongside the taverns and sometimes within them, and they attracted not only the sailors, but also the merchants and the minor colonial officials who found in gambling one of the few entertainments available in a town where the legitimate pleasures were limited. The prostitution that was one of Port Royal's most noted features was not unusual in a port town of this size and character, but the scale of it and the openness with which it operated were remarked on by almost everyone who wrote about the place. Women had come to Port Royal from various parts of the Atlantic world, some voluntarily and some as servants or slaves or wives who had not found the life they expected, and a significant number of them supported themselves through the sex trade that the large population of sailors and buccaneers made economically viable. The authorities made periodic attempts to regulate or suppress this trade, but the attempts were undermined by the same practical tolerance of vice that characterized the town's relationship with piracy. The understanding that the prosperity of Port Royal depended on keeping the sailors happy, and that happy sailors spent money. The church was not absent from Port Royal, and this is one of the things that makes the town's reputation so interesting, because it was not a place entirely without the forms of respectable religious life. There were several churches in the town, including the Anglican Church that served the English colonial community, and the clergy who served them were not entirely ineffective in their ministries. But the churches sat alongside the taverns in the same streets, and the services on Sunday morning competed with the entertainments of Saturday night for the attention of a population that had a fairly clear sense of its priorities. The clergymen of Port Royal, who wrote about their ministry, described a constant struggle against the culture of the town, a struggle that they conducted with varying degrees of energy and success. The diversity of Port Royal was another of its remarkable features, because it brought together people from an extraordinary range of backgrounds in a space so small that they could not avoid each other. There were English and Dutch and French sailors and merchants. There were Spanish prisoners and Portuguese traders. There were free black people who had come from various parts of the Caribbean with various histories, and who occupied a range of social positions, from wealthy merchants to day laborers. There were enslaved people who made up a significant portion of the town's population, and who did much of the work that kept it functioning, from the domestic service in the great merchants' houses to the labor on the wharves. And there were all the intermediate categories that a town at the intersection of multiple colonial systems produces, people whose identities and legal statuses were complicated and contested, and who found in Port Royal a place where the complications could be navigated, if not always resolved. No figure is more associated with Port Royal in its buccaneer heyday than Henry Morgan, the Welsh privateer whose career as a raider of Spanish settlements in the Caribbean made him simultaneously the most famous Englishman in the Americas and a figure of considerable embarrassment to the home government when his activities overstepped the bounds of what could be diplomatically defended. Morgan's relationship with Port Royal was intimate and long-lasting, beginning with his arrival in Jamaica sometime in the 1650s and continuing through his years as the most successful buccaneer in the Caribbean to his appointment as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica in 1675, an appointment that made him officially responsible for suppressing the kind of piracy that had made his own career. Morgan was born in Wales around 1635, and the details of his early life and how he came to Jamaica are not entirely clear from the surviving records. What is clear is that by the early 1660s, he had established himself as a capable and aggressive privateer operating out of Port Royal, and that his abilities attracted the attention of the governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford, who found in Morgan exactly the kind of instrument he needed for his policy of aggressive harassment of the Spanish colonies. Modiford was a plantation owner who understood the economics of the Caribbean colony and who recognized that the buccaneer trade, whatever its moral complications, was essential to the security and prosperity of Jamaica. He gave Morgan his commissions, and Morgan delivered results. The raid on Puerto Príncipe in Cuba in 1668 was Morgan's first major independent command, a successful, if not enormously profitable attack on a Cuban interior town that demonstrated his ability to organize and lead a substantial buccaneer force. His attack on Portobelo later that year was far more consequential, capturing one of the most important Spanish colonial ports, with a force that the Spanish had every reason to believe was too small for the task, and extracting a substantial ransom before withdrawing. The Portobelo raid established Morgan's reputation in the Caribbean and beyond, and it attracted to Port Royal the attention of buccaneers from across the region who wanted to sail under his command. The Maracaibo expedition of 1669, which raided the town and lake of Maracaibo on the Venezuelan coast and ended with a spectacular, if accidental, destruction of Spanish warships, was another demonstration of Morgan's ability to turn difficult circumstances to his advantage. When the Spanish sent a fleet to block his exit from the lake, Morgan responded with fire ships, unmanned vessels packed with combustibles, and steered toward the enemy fleet, and the resulting explosions destroyed the Spanish vessels with a completeness that removed the obstacle to his escape. The fireship tactics required both nerve and improvisational skill, and the account of the episode that reached England made Morgan a celebrated figure even before his greatest achievement. The Panama expedition of 1671, which assembled the largest buccaneer force in the history of the Caribbean and led it across the Isthmus of Panama through jungle and swamp to sack one of the richest cities in the Spanish Americas, was the peak of Morgan's career as a privateer and also its effective end. The crossing of the isthmus was an extraordinary achievement, 9 days of marching through hostile terrain with minimal food and constant threat of ambush, and the battle outside Panama City that resulted in the defeat of the Spanish defenders and the capture of the city was a genuine military achievement. But the sack of Panama was also conducted with a brutality that exceeded what even the broad standards of the period considered acceptable, and the amount of plunder that Morgan's men brought back was disappointing given the scale of the operation. partly because the city was burned, possibly by the Spanish themselves, before it could be fully looted. The political consequences of Panama were significant. England and Spain were nominally at peace when the raid occurred, which meant that Morgan had conducted an act of war without authorization, and both Modiford and Morgan were recalled to England to account for their actions. Morgan spent some time in London, where he was well received at court and in the coffee houses, and where the fame of his Caribbean exploits made him something of a celebrity rather than a criminal. He was eventually knighted, given the title of Sir Henry Morgan, and sent back to Jamaica as deputy governor, a remarkable rehabilitation that reflected both his personal connections at court and the political complexity of a situation in which his actions had been unauthorized but had served English interests reasonably well. As deputy governor, Morgan was tasked with suppressing the piracy that he had himself practiced, and he performed this function with the same energy and effectiveness that had characterized his privateering career. He issued proclamations against pirates, cooperated with naval forces in their pursuit, and presided over the trials and executions of men who had followed the same trade he had once led. The cynicism of this transformation was noted by contemporaries, and the charges that Morgan enriched himself through the deputy governorship in ways that were not entirely different from the methods he had used as a buccaneer were probably not entirely unfounded. He died in Jamaica in 1688, a wealthy man with a plantation and a townhouse, and the contradictions of his career unresolved, leaving behind him a city that was already beginning to feel the consequences of the trade that had built it. Port Royal, in the years after Morgan's death, was changing. The balance between the buccaneer economy and the plantation economy shifting in favor of the latter as the English colonial project in Jamaica matured, and as the legal and diplomatic environment for privateering became increasingly unfavorable. The buccaneers were still there, still using the harbor and still spending money in the taverns, but they were increasingly operating without official sanction, increasingly defined as pirates rather than privateers, and increasingly subject to the legal consequences that the distinction carried. The town continued to grow and to prosper, its harbor still the busiest in the English Caribbean, but the particular character that the buccaneer years had given it was being gradually overlaid by the more respectable, if equally brutal in its own ways, character of the plantation economy. The economy of Port Royal, at its height in the 1670s and 1680s, was a complex mixture of legitimate and illegitimate commerce, formal and informal trade, the visible business of merchants and factors and ships' agents, and the less visible business of the receivers of stolen goods and the suppliers of services to people who did not want their names in any record. The harbor was the center of everything, the place where all the flows of the Atlantic economy came together, and the men who controlled the wharves and the warehouses and the credit that moved goods from one place to another were the real powers of the town, regardless of whatever the governor's commission said about the formal political hierarchy. The sugar trade was the most important of the legitimate flows because Jamaica was by the 1680s becoming one of the most productive sugar colonies in the English Empire. The sugar plantations of the island's interior operated by enslaved labor on a scale that dwarfed anything in the earlier period of the colony, were producing enough sugar to fill many ships a year with hogsheads of brown sugar and puncheons of rum, and the merchants of Port Royal, who managed the trade between the plantations and the markets of England and the other English colonies, were building substantial fortunes on the proceeds. The rum that was a byproduct of sugar production was itself a significant commodity, finding ready markets wherever there were sailors and soldiers and workers who needed cheap and powerful drink. The slave trade was the dark foundation of all of this prosperity, as it was of all Caribbean colonial economies in this period. Port Royal was the principal English slave trading port in the Caribbean in the second half of the 17th century, the place where the ships of the Royal African Company and the independent traders who competed with it brought their human cargoes from West Africa to be sold to the plantation owners of Jamaica and the other English Caribbean colonies. The numbers were enormous. Tens of thousands of people transported across the Atlantic in conditions of deliberate brutality designed to maximize the number that survived, while minimizing the cost of the transport, bought and sold on the wharves of Port Royal with the same commercial efficiency that was applied to the transactions in sugar and rum and manufactured goods. The enslaved people who were sold through Port Royal came primarily from West Africa, from the regions that the slave traders called the Gold Coast and the Slave Coast and the Windward Coast, from communities that had been torn apart by the combination of the Atlantic slave trade and the wars and raids that the trade both produced and depended on. They arrived in Jamaica, speaking dozens of different languages, practicing dozens of different religions, carrying the memories of lives that had been violently interrupted, and they were distributed to the plantations of the interior, where they would spend the rest of their lives in the conditions that the plantation system imposed, conditions of forced labor and limited autonomy that were maintained by the threat and the reality of violence. The free black and mixed-race population of Port Royal itself occupied a complicated position in the town's social hierarchy. There were free people of color who were significant property owners and merchants, men and women who had accumulated wealth through trade or skilled labor or the proceeds of the buccaneer economy, and who occupied a middle position in a society that was formally organized around racial categories, but that was in practice more fluid than the formal categories suggested. There were also free black people of more modest means, craftsmen and sailors and domestic workers who supported themselves through labor, but who maintained their legal freedom in a society where freedom was a meaningful distinction. And there were the enslaved people who worked in the town's households and warehouses and wharves, whose lives were governed by the same codes of slavery that applied on the plantations, but whose urban situation gave them somewhat more opportunity for the informal negotiations and accommodations that made enslaved life slightly more livable than the plantation system's worst possibilities. The credit system that made the commerce of Port Royal possible was a remarkable financial infrastructure for a colonial town of this period. The merchants who dominated the Port Royal economy were not simply buyers and sellers of goods, but financiers and credit providers, men who extended credit to planters and buccaneers and other merchants who held deposits and made loans and discounted bills of exchange, and in general performed the functions of a banking system in a society that had no banks in the formal sense. The credit networks connected Port Royal to London and to the other English colonial ports, and the bills of exchange that circulated through the Port Royal commercial community were negotiable instruments that could be cashed in London as easily as in Jamaica. The physical infrastructure of the town at its height was substantial given its small size. There were warehouses stocked with goods of every description, from the sugar and rum of the island's own production to the spices and silks and manufactured goods that came from the trade with the wider Atlantic world. There were the wharves, where the ships loaded and unloaded, busy from first light to last, the sound of cargo being moved and ships being worked a constant background to the life of the waterfront. There were the taverns and the gaming houses and the establishments of various kinds that served the needs of the large population of sailors and other transient workers who passed through the town. And there were the houses of the merchants and the colonial officials, some of them quite substantial buildings by Caribbean standards, with multiple rooms and good furniture and the amenities that money could provide in a town at the crossroads of the Atlantic trade. The morning of the 7th of June, 1692 was a Tuesday, and by all accounts, it began as a perfectly ordinary day in Port Royal. The harbor was full of ships, as it usually was, and the town was going about its business with the particular energy of a Caribbean port in the full heat of the trading season. People were in the markets and the counting houses and the wharves. The churches were open for the midweek services that the Anglican community maintained, and the taverns that had been full the night before were beginning to prepare for the day's trade. At about 11:30 in the morning, the earth moved. The earthquake that struck Port Royal on that June morning was not a single shock, but a sequence. The first tremor, followed by a second and then a third, each one more violent than the last, and the total duration of the main shaking was perhaps 2 minutes, long enough for the people caught in it to understand what was happening, but not long enough for most of them to do anything useful about it. 2 minutes of violent shaking is an extraordinarily long time when the ground beneath your feet is moving, and what those 2 minutes did to Port Royal was catastrophic beyond anything that the town's inhabitants had experienced or imagined. The problem was the sand. Port Royal was built on a sand spit, a formation that was geologically unstable in the particular way that matters most during an earthquake, because the shaking that travels through solid ground behaves very differently when it enters a mass of water-saturated sand. The process called liquefaction occurs when the shaking causes the water in the spaces between the sand grains to be suddenly forced upward, turning the mixture from solid ground into something with the consistency of quicksand, and liquefaction is essentially what happened to large parts of Port Royal on the 7th of June. The ground did not crack or heave, but simply ceased to be solid, and the buildings on top of it, without the foundation they depended on, collapsed or tilted, or in some cases simply slid into the water. The areas of the town closest to the harbor entrance sank most dramatically, several city blocks disappearing beneath the water in the space of the earthquake's duration. Eyewitness accounts describe the experience with a vividness that makes the horror of it present across 3 centuries. The ground opening, the buildings tilting and falling, the sea rushing in, people running and being swallowed by the earth and the water simultaneously. The accounts are sometimes contradictory in their details, as eyewitness accounts of disasters always are, but they agree on the essential facts that a significant portion of Port Royal, including some of its most substantial buildings and many of its inhabitants, disappeared into the harbor in a matter of minutes. The numbers are difficult to establish with certainty, because the records of the town were themselves largely destroyed in the disaster, but estimates suggest that somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people died in the earthquake and the immediate aftermath out of a total population of perhaps 8,000 to 10,000. Of those deaths, some came from the collapse of buildings, some from the drowning that occurred when the ground sank beneath the water, and some from the tsunami that followed the main earthquake, a wave that swept over the low-lying parts of the town and the surrounding area and drowned people who had survived the initial shaking. The bodies were numerous enough that in the days and weeks that followed the earthquake, they were a serious public health problem, and the survivors had to deal with the threat of epidemic disease on top of everything else that the disaster had produced. The ships in the harbor were affected in various ways, some being swamped by the tsunami, and some being carried onto the land by the wave, and others riding out the chaos with relatively minor damage. One ship, the Swan, was carried by the wave from the harbor across the submerged area of the town, its keel passing over the rooftops of the buildings that had sunk beneath the water, an image that appears in several contemporary accounts and that captures the surreal quality of the disaster as vividly as anything else that was recorded. The captain of the Swan, Emmanuel Heath, survived and wrote one of the most detailed accounts of what he witnessed, a document that is one of the primary sources for the earthquake and its immediate aftermath. The survivors who gathered on the surviving parts of the spit in the hours after the earthquake found themselves in desperate circumstances, the town in ruins around them, the harbor full of debris and bodies, the supplies and the buildings and the infrastructure that had made Port Royal functional, largely destroyed. The heat was intense, as Caribbean heat always is in June, and the water supplies that the town had depended on were contaminated or inaccessible. Disease followed quickly, as it always does in the aftermath of disasters that kill large numbers of people and destroy the systems that manage waste and water, and the epidemic that swept through the survivors in the weeks after the earthquake killed more people than the earthquake itself. The clergyman who had preached in Port Royal's churches without noticeable effect during the town's years of prosperity interpreted the earthquake with the confidence of people who believed they understood exactly what they were seeing. God had struck down the most wicked city in the world, had demonstrated with geological force what moral suasion had failed to communicate, and the ruins that steamed in the Caribbean heat were the judgment of the Almighty on a community that had defied him for too long. This interpretation was widely shared in England as well, where the news of Port Royal's destruction arrived in July and was received with something that combined genuine horror with a certain satisfaction at the apparent confirmation of theological principles. Whether the earthquake was divine judgment or simply the inevitable consequence of building a dense urban settlement on an unstable sand formation in a geologically active region is a question that the different worldviews of the 17th century and the 21st century answer very differently. What is not open to dispute is that the earthquake of June 1692 was one of the most destructive natural disasters in the history of the Caribbean, and that it destroyed in 2 minutes a city that had taken nearly 4 decades to build. The survivors of the Port Royal earthquake did not simply abandon the site and go elsewhere. The harbor was still the best in the Caribbean, and the commercial infrastructure, damaged as it was, could not easily be replicated on another site. The people who remained in Jamaica after the earthquake began almost immediately to rebuild, first in temporary structures on the surviving parts of the spit, and then in more permanent buildings. As the scale of the reconstruction task became clearer, Port Royal was not finished as a settlement, but it was finished as the most important port in the English Caribbean. The reconstruction was hampered by the continuing instability of the site, which was shaken by several significant aftershocks in the months and years after the main earthquake, and by a fire in 1693 that destroyed much of what had been rebuilt from the earthquake. The combination of earthquake damage and fire damage left Port Royal a fraction of its former size, and the commercial activity that had made it important was increasingly redirected to a new settlement across the harbor, the town that would become Kingston, which had the advantage of being built on firmer ground, and which gradually supplanted Port Royal as the commercial and administrative center of the English colony. Port Royal did not disappear entirely. It remained a functioning settlement throughout the 18th century and beyond, its role shifting from the great commercial port of the buccaneer age to a naval base and a fishing village, and eventually a small town at the end of the Palisados, with a population that was a small fraction of what it had been at its height. The Royal Navy used the harbor and the dockyard at Port Royal throughout the 18th century, and the town retained some of its character as a place that served maritime needs, but the extraordinary concentration of wealth and vice and vitality that had made it famous was gone, replaced by something much more ordinary. The great merchants who had accumulated fortunes in Port Royal relocated to Kingston or to the interior of the island, and the plantation economy that had been developing alongside the buccaneer trade became the dominant mode of the Jamaican colonial economy. The sugar plantations of the interior, worked by enslaved people in numbers that had been growing throughout the 17th century, became the principal source of the colony's wealth, and the port that served them was increasingly Kingston rather than Port Royal. Jamaica became one of the most important sugar colonies in the British Empire, and the wealth that was generated by the forced labor of enslaved Africans in its fields flowed through Kingston to London and enriched the metropole in ways that shaped the development of British capitalism in the 18th century. The history of Jamaica after Port Royal is partly the history of slavery and partly the history of resistance to slavery. The maroon communities in the mountains of the interior, the descendants of the Africans who had escaped from the Spanish before the English conquest, and those who had escaped from English plantations subsequently, maintained their freedom through a long series of conflicts with the colonial authorities. The Maroon Wars of the 18th century that ended with treaties recognizing Maroon autonomy in exchange for cooperation with the colonial government in returning escaped slaves. The contradictions of this settlement, which gave the Maroons their freedom at the cost of becoming agents of the system that enslaved others, were real and recognized by contemporaries on all sides. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and of slavery itself in 1833 transformed the Jamaican economy in ways that the colonial planters feared and resisted, and the subsequent history of the island is one of poverty and migration and the slow, uneven process of building a society on the foundations of a colonial system that had been designed to extract wealth rather than to create conditions for human flourishing. the legacy of the plantation economy and the slave trade is still visible in Jamaica in the 21st century in the patterns of land ownership and economic development and social inequality that reflect centuries of colonial history. Port Royal itself, the physical place, settled into its long afterlife as a small fishing community and naval base. Its extraordinary past, known mainly to historians and to the local people who lived with the awareness that beneath the harbor water were the ruins of buildings that had once made their town the most important port in the English Americas. Occasional object surfaced, artifacts that had been part of the submerged town, reminding the living community that the harbor held a city as well as fish, and these objects attracted the attention of the occasional antiquarian or treasure hunter who wondered what else might be preserved in the warm, shallow water of the harbor. The ruins of the sunken part of Port Royal lie in water that ranges from about 1 to 17 meters deep, which makes them accessible in principle to anyone with diving equipment, but also makes them subject to the natural processes of the shallow harbor environment, the movement of sediment, and the action of marine organisms, and the disturbance caused by the ships and boats that continue to use the harbor. The preservation of the submerged ruins has been uneven, the wooden structures having largely disappeared, while the brick and stone foundations and the metal objects and the ceramics have survived in much better condition. Archaeological investigation of the submerged ruins began seriously in the 1950s, when the American Marine archaeologist Edwin Link conducted the first systematic underwater excavation of the site and brought up enough artifacts to demonstrate that the potential for recovery of information about the 17th century city was extraordinary. Link's work was followed by several other investigations over the subsequent decades, culminating in a major project led by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology that began in the 1980s and continued through the 1990s, producing the most systematic and most scientifically rigorous investigation of the site that has yet been conducted. What the archaeologists found in the ruins of Port Royal was something remarkable, a collection of everyday objects that had been trapped in the moment of the earthquake and preserved in conditions that protected them from the disturbance that surface sites inevitably suffer over the centuries. There were ceramic vessels, wine bottles and storage jars, and drinking vessels, many of them complete, and some of them with their contents still inside. There were pewter plates and dishes and cups, the tableware of the ordinary inhabitants of the town. There were tools and weights and measures, and the equipment of trades and crafts, objects that speak of the daily working life of a commercial port town. There were coins and tokens, the small change of an economy that was more monetized than most colonial economies of the period. One of the most significant finds from the Port Royal excavations was a watch, an English watch dating to the 1680s that had stopped at 17 minutes to 12, a time that corresponds closely to the estimated time of the earthquake. The watch is one of those extraordinary objects that archaeology occasionally produces, an artifact that connects the abstract facts of history to the specific moment of a specific event in a way that makes the past suddenly and viscerally present. The watch stopped at 17 minutes to 12 on the 7th of June 1692, and the person who owned it died with their watch, and both of them ended up on the bottom of Kingston Harbor where they remained for nearly 3 centuries until they were recovered. The archaeological record of Port Royal has also provided information about the people who lived there, not only through the objects they used, but through the remains of the buildings themselves, which preserve in their layouts and their materials the patterns of how people organized their living and working spaces. The warehouses that lined the harbor front can be traced in their foundations. The taverns and the shops can be identified by the goods that were stored in them. The houses of the merchants and the houses of the ordinary inhabitants can be distinguished by the size and quality of their construction and by the character of the objects found within them. The information that archaeology has recovered from Port Royal supplements, and in some ways corrects the documentary record of the town, because the documents that survived the earthquake and the subsequent destruction were produced primarily by the wealthy and the literate. The merchants and the colonial officials who kept records and whose letters were preserved in archives in England. The archaeological record speaks more directly to the lives of the people who did not keep records, the ordinary sailors and laborers and enslaved people and free people of color who made up the majority of Port Royal's population and who are largely absent from the surviving written sources. The submerged ruins of Port Royal have been designated a protected archaeological site, and the ongoing management of the site is concerned both with the preservation of what remains and with the careful recovery of additional information. The shallow water environment in which the ruins lie is fragile and easily disturbed, and the protection of the site from unauthorized treasure hunting and from the accidental damage that commercial harbor activity can cause is a continuing challenge for the Jamaican authorities responsible for it. The value of the site is not in any treasure that might be recovered from it, but in the information it preserves about a moment in Caribbean history that was both remarkable and terrible. The concentrated expression of everything that the colonial world of the 17th century was capable of producing. Port Royal sits today at the end of the Palisados, a small town with a few thousand inhabitants who live with the sea on all sides and the long history of their place pressing up around them through the centuries. The harbor is still there, still one of the best natural harbors in the Caribbean, still used by the ships of the Jamaican merchant marine, and the fishing boats that go out every morning and come back every evening. The water of the harbor is the same water that closed over the rooftops of the sunken city in 1692, the same warm Caribbean water that has been there since before the first people arrived on the island, and that will be there long after the last of the current inhabitants have passed on. Beneath the water, in the warm, shallow darkness that the sunlight can barely penetrate, the ruins of the old city lie in the mud. The brick walls and the stone foundations and the iron bolts and the ceramic sherds and the pewter plates and the coins that have been sitting there for more than 3 centuries now. The watch that stopped at 17 minutes to 12 has been recovered and is in a museum somewhere, its hands still fixed at the moment of the earthquake. The small brass wheels and springs that once measured time frozen in the last moment they measured, but the city around it, the city that gave it context and meaning, the warehouses and the taverns and the churches and the brothels and the grand houses of the merchants and the cramped dwellings of the sailors, all of that remains where the earthquake put it, preserved in the darkness below the harbor water. A city that existed and was destroyed and that continues to exist in the only form available to destroyed cities, as the object of memory and imagination and the patient investigation of archaeology. The most wicked city on earth, if that is what it was, is also one of the most complete glimpses of the 17th century Caribbean that has survived, because the earthquake that destroyed it also preserved it, sealing it in a moment of time that the ordinary processes of decay and rebuilding and change would otherwise have erased. The destruction of Port Royal was a catastrophe for the people who experienced it, a disaster of the first order that killed thousands and erased in minutes the accumulation of decades. But it was also, in the long run, a kind of preservation, a moment frozen in the mud of Kingston Harbor that allows us, 3.5 centuries later, to see something of what the city was, to hold the watch that stopped at 17 minutes to 12, and feel the weight of it in the hand, and understand, in the way that only a physical object can make you understand, that the past was real, and the people in it were real, and the city they built and lost was real. Let Port Royal rest now in the warm water of the harbor. Let the mud settle over the ruins, and the marine life go about its business among the old walls. Let the watch that stopped at 17 minutes to 12 keep its time, which is the same time it has always kept since the morning the earthquake took it. The city is still there, under the water, in the dark, and the sea moves above it, as it always has, patient and indifferent and very old. And so, we leave Port Royal resting in the darkness of 3.5 centuries, half above the water and half below it, the ruins of what it was lying in the warm mud of Kingston Harbor, and the small town that survived, sitting at the end of the palisados in the Caribbean sun. We walked through the world that made it, the English conquest of Jamaica, and the growth of the buccaneer trade, and the particular combination of geography and commerce and lawlessness that made Port Royal possible. We sat in its taverns and its counting houses and tried to understand how a town of perhaps 8,000 people became the most important port in the English Americas and the most notorious city in the Atlantic world. We sailed with Henry Morgan from Portobelo to Panama and back again, and we watched the privateering economy that had built Port Royal slowly transform into something more respectable and more brutal. The plantation economy and the slave trade that would define Jamaica for the next 2 centuries. We stood on the sand of the palisados at 11:30 in the morning on the 7th of June, 1692, and felt the ground begin to move, and we watched the city go into the water, part of it instantly and part of it slowly over the weeks and months that followed. And we descended with the archaeologists into the warm, shallow darkness of the harbor to recover what remained, the ceramic sherds and the pewter plates and the watch that stopped at 17 minutes to 12. These are human stories. The people who built Port Royal were human, with all the complexity and contradiction that implies, capable of the violence of the buccaneer trade and the brutality of the slave trade, and also of the energy and the ingenuity and the genuine commercial creativity that built one of the most remarkable urban environments in the 17th century Americas. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue and let the ancient world keep talking in its old, slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The harbor is quiet. The ruins are dark. The watch has stopped. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open slowly. The way hands open when the day has finally let go of you and the night has taken over. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like the warm Caribbean water moving above the sunken city in the darkness, covering everything, patient and indifferent, and very, very old. Sleep well, and good night.